Welcome to The Jewish Lens, a podcast to discuss anything and everything from a Jewish perspective. Now, please help me welcome the man who controls the media, your host, Jonathan Rosen.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of The Jewish Lens. I'm Jonathan Rosen, and today I am thrilled to welcome a media literacy educator and advocate, and he's also the author of the critically acclaimed graphic novel, We Survived the Holocaust, the Bluma and Felix Goldberg story, Frank Baker. Frank, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you, Jonathan, for having me. It's a real pleasure. Let me say Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. Happy New Year. Yes.
Happy Hanukkah to all of those who celebrate.
Although this will probably be out much later in the month. Yes. Happy New Year. Well, we do have a lot to cover. I want to start with you. So you grew up in South Carolina, I was reading. So what was your upbringing like, especially in regard to Judaism? Were you from an observant family?
Actually, no, we were Reform, and we were part of the Reform congregation. Of course, I went to Sunday school and was bar mitzvahed. In fact, I'm a twin, so my twin and I were bar mitzvahed together, and we were confirmed. And so, small Jewish community of two synagogues. I was a member of the Tree of Life Temple, the Reform, and then, of course, there was the Beth Shalom Orthodox Synagogue, which my twin brother eventually joined.
Oh, really?
And so, small Jewish community. We had a Jewish community center, and we spent a lot of time there, and socializing and getting to know everybody. And eventually, I went to college at the University of Georgia, and was a TEP at Georgia, the Jewish fraternity, for a couple of years. And
I was AEPI, so it's similar.
Yeah, I knew a lot of AEPIs at Georgia, and got to meet a lot of young Jews from across the Southeast.
I have to go back there. Okay, so in the bar mitzvah as a twin, how was that for both of you? Was it something that was fun, or did you both hate that you had to share the day?
I think it was an incredible experience. At the time, you're sharing this wonderful event,
right,
with a brother that you've grown up with and shared a bedroom with all of your
and
life.
Hopefully, right.
Yeah, my late mother, may she rest in peace, said you didn't have a half Torah, you had a quadruple Torah.
I'm glad you both had a great. It could probably, I think, would be some nerves having to share it together with someone the experience too.
No, I think, for me, looking back on it, it was a wonderful experience. I mean, I remember looking out on the congregation, and there were my grandparents and aunts and uncles and friends from Sunday school and from middle school. It's just wonderful to see. I also remember the synagogue had this partition. They had to open it up to put even more chairs at. So the fact that the Baker boys were being bar mitzvah brought a larger crowd into the synagogue that day.
Wasn't that a movie, The Baker Boys, right? The Fabulous Baker Boys?
Yeah, and I was one of. I'm still getting residuals from that movie.
Well, okay, so you're a media literacy educator. So what does that mean exactly? What is your responsibilities for that?
I define media literacy as applying critical thinking skills to all media messages. And I'll just give you the backstory of how I got to media literacy, if you don't mind.
Sure.
I worked in television news, and my last stop was Orlando, Florida, where I went to work for the public school system. And among other things, I was the buyer of films and videos for this large school system. And that got me very close to curriculum. So after being in the job a couple of years, I said to my supervisor, could I leave the building and go into some classrooms and watch these teachers using these materials? And at the end of the week, I'm writing this report, and I'm really frustrated. I didn't see one teacher in that entire week engage students in any critical viewing skills. In other words,
they just put on the movie and let it go.
Yeah, they didn't prepare students with some pre-viewing questions. They didn't introduce any vocabulary they might hear. They didn't ask for any post-viewing questions. And I got back to the office, and I began investigating the phrase critical viewing skills, which surprisingly is no longer used anymore. I think it's more part of visual literacy. But I found that critical viewing skills was part of something larger called media literacy. And these were the days primarily before the internet. So we were talking about television and radio and newspapers. And how do we get young people to think critically about who's telling them this, what techniques are they using? Can we identify bias and stereotypes? Is there propaganda in that message? All of those things. I created a website which still exists today, the Media Literacy Clearinghouse, whose URL is my name, frankwbaker.com. And I wrote a few books, and I continued to talk to teachers about how important it was that when we teach students to read, which is important, why don't we teach them how to read the media, how to read a photograph, how to read a film, how to really understand who is behind the media and what is their motivation, and all of those things. And so I've been teaching media literacy for about 25 years now.
I think you hit an important aspect there. There are a lot of times, and I saw it too, I was a teacher for a long time, that things are put on where you don't look at who is this going to benefit? Where's the bias in this? Who gains from this? Who is this against? It's not just a straight piece like for entertainment viewing for the most part. A lot of these things. But have you been involved in any Holocaust education prior to this? We're going to get to your book in a second, but I'm just curious about that.
Not really. Tangentially, I was always interested in the Holocaust, and it reminded me that when I returned to South Carolina after having worked in Florida and in television news, I went to the textbook depository here, where you could sample any one of the textbooks in the state that had been adopted. And so I walked in one day and said, I'd like to see all of the American history textbooks and the world history textbooks. And so I spent several hours, and I was really appalled. I was looking for references to the Holocaust. And it may surprise you, or may not, that the Holocaust got one paragraph and one photograph in these textbooks. Now, things have started to change, but it told me that public education is not spending enough time providing our young people with enough background. And I think all of that is even today it's even worse. You may know that the Claims Conference a couple of years ago did an international survey, and they found that lots of people, and especially millennials, had no idea how many Jews were killed in the Holocaust. They couldn't name one ghetto or concentration camp. The amount of ignorance out there, and it's not just young people, it's adults as well. And I began to ask social studies teachers, because I'm so involved in education here, why are our students so apparently lacking knowledge? And they said, Frank, we don't have the time. We simply don't have the time. But a colleague of mine said, Frank, it's not time, it's priority.
Right.
And so I began to realize, why do we have Holocaust museums, Holocaust centers, Holocaust education efforts? It's to fill the gap of what's not happening in education.
No, I'm not surprised at all. I've read so many things about schools not implementing it. My school did at the time. We took like a 2-week right in the middle break from other things to teach Holocaust, and I put a unit on the Holocaust. But I read the same thing as you just mentioned, that a lot of schools are not doing it today, and there is a total lack of awareness, and even among adults. You're right. So how did you come to know the Goldbergs?
Well, they were contemporaries of my parents. So I grew up knowing the Goldbergs. I knew their children. We'd see each other at social events. I'm not even sure when I realized that Felix and Bluma were Holocaust survivors, but something happened in the year 2000. Mr. Goldberg, of blessed memory, was speaking at our synagogue during Yom HaShoah, and it just happened to be right before he passed away. And I'm sitting in the audience of this event, and I am totally riveted by his story uh, unbelievable cruelty, being a slave laborer. And even though I'm sitting with hundreds of other people, I felt like he was talking just to me.
Mhm.
Just to me. And it was the most moving thing. I didn't really realize it at the time. But after this ceremony, and if you've attended a Yom HaShoah ceremony, you know that can be very long. At the end of the ceremony, there was a welcoming line, and I'm in line to greet him. And he sees me, and he said, in this beautiful Polish accent, he hands me his speech. And he says in Polish accent, Frankie, do something with this.
Oh.
I knew he did not mean throw it away. I took it home, and I got to tell you, I sat with that speech for years, not feeling worthy or even qualified. What makes me qualified to tell his Holocaust story? Well, I finally got off my tuchus and approached the family members one day. I said, I'd like to create a website that tells your mother and your father's story. Both of them were survivors. And they said, fine, go right ahead. And I began to research everything that I knew about them using all of my education background skills, research skills, media literacy skills. I found everything that had been published about the Goldbergs, including videotaped interviews here in South Carolina by public television.
Wow.
And I started to put together this website, which was divided into 3 sections. The website is storiesofsurvival.org, and it's in 3 parts: before the war, during the war, and after the war. And after we created the website, I said, well, I need to now share this website across the state. And I would attend Holocaust Teachers Institutes, go to the state social studies conference, and present the website. And I got lots of positive feedback. One day, I was talking to a colleague of mine at the University of South Carolina, and I said, would you look at this website? I think their story, which was told chronologically, would make a great graphic novel. And this educator said, yes, I totally agree. And she put me in touch with a publisher that afternoon. We spoke by phone, and he offered me a contract on the phone, even though I had not even written a word.
That happens to authors all the time. Oh, as a writer, I'm kidding. Yes.
I was so surprised.
Right.
And then I got partnered with this award-winning
I was
illustrator.
going to ask you about this. Should they assign the illustrator to you and write off?
He did. And I was, in fact, just talking to Tim Ogline today on the phone, because we have just recently published here in 2025 a 2nd edition of the book with some new material. And so I began, Jonathan, sitting down and writing scenes and dialogue. And every day I would share this with Tim, and he would create the illustrations, and I would share those with the family members who really, they had no idea what a graphic novel was. In fact, when I met with them, I said, I want to create a graphic novel about your parents. And they said, what's a graphic novel? And I pulled John Lewis's March out and gave it to them. And they said, oh, we get it now. We understand.
So what made you decide to go the graphic novel route instead of going to like a novel or like a nonfiction, instead just like a memoir type thing?
Well, it was very clear to me that the graphic novel is one of the most popular genres and mediums that young people are reading today. In fact, when I go back to having worked at the public school system in Orlando, Florida, back then, the librarians told me back then in the 90s, late 90s, that the graphic novels frequently get checked out and frequently they don't come back. So I realized that. And I also realized through the years, I went to Barnes and Noble, and the 9/11 Commission report, if you'd ever seen it, was like this thick. But there's a 9/11 graphic novel adaptation that was endorsed by the 9/11 commissioners. And so in addition to the fiction graphic novels that are out there, there's nonfiction that are very popular. The Diary of Anne Frank now has 2 different versions, graphic novels. And so I decided this is the route I would like to go. If young people are oblivious to the scope of the Holocaust, which we know. And teachers were telling me, Frank, we've got the Diary of Anne Frank, we've got Elie Wiesel's Night,
Right.
we want something else. And they are reacting so positively already to our book, because it is a South Carolina story, but it's a story of survival. And one of the family members said to me, Frank, what makes our parents' story worth telling? And, to be honest, I didn't have an answer. All I knew was I was given a charge by Felix Goldberg before he passed away. Tell my story. And I felt I needed to take this on. And it's been a labor of love.
Yeah, before we dive deeper into the book, can you give a little bit of background on Felix and Bluma, just a little bit, so you can get a sense of who they were and where they came from, what they experienced a little bit?
They were young Jews born in small Polish towns. They had normal lives until Poland was, invaded during the war. He found himself recruited by the Polish army and eventually sent to ghettos and concentration camps. He was very fortunate. He looked strong, and he was strong, and so he took several risks. But if you're at the Holocaust, you're going to do everything in your power to see the light of the next day. Bluma was 13 years old when the Germans invaded her town. Her sister was 19, and the two of them were together the entire time through the war. And she said many times she would not have survived if it had not been for her sister by her side. And like Felix, she had a very normal childhood in the small Polish town where she grew up. She said she skied in the winter and swam in the lakes in the summer. He played soccer, but their lives quickly changed.
Mm-hmm.
In our book, she tells the story that one day the Nazis were knocking on doors and killing people at random. And their mother gathered the two of the girls together and said, here's the family jewels. Here's all the money I've got. Run out the back door into the woods. You're going to need this to survive. And the girls protested, but their mother pushed them out the door, and they heard gunfire and they ran into the woods, and they survived for months until the Germans one day drove a truck up to the woods with a loudspeaker and said, Jews, we know you're hiding. Come out, we'll take care of you. And they did. They put the two girls to work, first in a factory making bullets, and later they were moved into another location where they were painting planes that were used by the Germans.
Oh.
And so it was a matter of survival for the two of them. Eventually, they both were liberated. They met at a displaced persons camp. And how they met is an interesting story. She wanted her picture taken, and he had a camera. And so they met. He had the picture taken and developed, and he goes to deliver it to her. And she's very impressed. It's a good picture. And she says, how could I repay you? And he said, with a kiss. And she protested. He kissed her anyway, and she slapped him. And that's the way the relationship started. Eventually, they married in the DP camp, and their marriage occurred on the same day as her sister and her husband. So it was a double wedding. Her sister and her husband eventually immigrated to South Carolina. And when it came time, Bluma said, I want to be with my sister. And authorities said, you really can't be placed into a community unless you have some kind of support. And they did. They settled in Columbia, South Carolina in the early 50s and began their lives.
Now, I'm just curious. This still doesn't have so much to do with it. I'm curious about you. You were friends with a daughter. You said you're friends with their children. So, and I think I was reading that their daughter Esther that you were friends with, right?
Oh yeah, I was in love with Esther. In fact, I asked her the other day, why didn't your daddy and my daddy arrange the marriage?
Is there a good answer to that first?
Oh yeah, well, she met another guy while I was away, and he's a great guy.
Okay, well, I'm curious now the relationship, because I've read with children of Holocaust survivors, it's sometimes mixed. Sometimes their parents tell them things that happen, and sometimes they just don't discuss it. They just don't want to go. So I'm curious about what their relationship was with them. That was never talked about with you.
Their parents rarely talked about
Mhm.
their experience, but something happened in the mid 90s. Schindler's List came out,
Right.
and the Goldbergs admitted that they were more felt more comfortable talking about their experience after that time. There is a story related to me by Henry, their oldest son, before their father passed away. He came into the room and said, "I have a confession to make, son." And his son listened, and his father, Felix, said, "I helped build the gallows." And he had kept that secret and never shared it until the last days of his life. And I'm sure it must have been a painful memory to have to confess to his son. But I'm sure both Bluma and Felix had many memories that are not worth retelling
Right.
or bringing back to the surface.
Yeah. So how did you go about once you got the task to this is I would like you to do something with this. How did you go about the research? Did you have like sit down, conduct interviews with all the Goldbergs, collect like look up other things that you could find them? How did that go about?
Well, all of the above. Um, I initially interviewed each of the family members separately. I wanted to hear from them. Uh, for example, I asked each of them, "Do you ever recall asking your father about his tattoo?" And they had not.
Mhm.
Um, but the research process was something that I had already done for the teacher's website. So I already had the details of where each of them was captured, where they were moved, all of that. So I had it in a chronological order. And as we began writing the book, my illustrator, Tim, became a fact checker with me. And if Felix Goldberg said one night after working in a coal mine, they came back to the camp, and Felix said found that part of the camp had been bombed by the Americans. Well, researching it, Tim found that the camp had been bombed by the Soviets, not by the Americans. So it was incumbent upon us as writers and fact checkers to make sure that what we were writing was accurate. And so we did a lot of that. A lot of the research had already been done, but now it was how do you translate this chronological story into a narrative that would be interesting for the reader, and then to consider the reader's age. So we're talking about young adults, we're talking about middle and high school students, because in South Carolina and in the United States, the Holocaust falls in 5th through 12th grade in those teaching standards.
So I'm just curious. So how was that for you? Because were there things in general that you might not have known? I don't mean specifically about the Goldbergs. I mean, but in general about the events of the time and perhaps some of the atrocities that occurred. I'm asking. When I was a kid, my dad had conducted interviews with some survivors, and I went along on some of them. I remember. So just curious how that was for you when you started hearing all these stories.
I think it's always a challenge, and I think it's always difficult. I just recently finished a book about how the Nuremberg trials were covered by journalists from around the world. And for those journalists sitting in the audience, listening to the evidence day after day after day, it takes its toll. It takes its toll. Uh, it's hard to hear what happened during the Holocaust, but it's important for young people to hear and to know it. Do they need to see graphic images of bodies? Absolutely not. But we need them to understand what was behind Hitler's final solution, what motivated them, how were laws passed in Germany that restricted the liberties and the freedoms of Jews. Eventually, you know, Hitler trying to destroy the Jewish race, um, and the collaborators. When I speak to students these days, Jonathan, I start with a series of questions. How many of you all know what the Holocaust was? How many of you all know who Adolf Hitler was?
Mm-hmm.
How many of you all know who the collaborators of the Nazis were? Most students don't have no idea. I'll ask, how many of you all know what propaganda is? And the young people that I'm with, they cannot define it. And the last question I'm asking is, how many of you all know what anti-Semitism is? Because in my talk about this book, I have to talk about anti-Semitism. I have to talk about the Goldberg story, and I have to talk about media literacy, because these young people that I'm speaking to are not reading newspapers. They're not watching the news at 6:30. They're getting their information from social media, which is a dangerous place to get news and information, but they don't know any better. And it begs the question, why aren't we teaching students to be media literate in 2025?
I'm going to get back to that in a second. Just curious, first, from the time that Felix tasked you to writing it, just curious, how long did it take you from the time that he said, "Hey, let's do this," to a finished product?
You're not going to believe this, but about a month.
Really? Wow.
Yeah, I was diligent. I mean, it actually started pouring out of me that I was so anxious to tell this story. One of the first things that I did was I contacted the local newspaper in town, and so I said, I think I've got an exclusive for you. I've got a book coming out about Holocaust survivors from Columbia, South Carolina, and they agreed to publish 4 parts. And so I began writing a narrative, which the newspaper published with a couple of photographs. But that's really how it started with me. It just came pouring out of me, this story of these 2 young Polish Jews and the challenges that they faced, the horrific conditions, never knowing whether they're going to see the light of the next day, and taking risks. What am I going to do? Bluma tells the story that her sister got sick with typhus, and so she, late at night, left the barracks knowing she had to find some food or medicine to help her sister. And she goes into the kitchen of the camp and finds an apple, and she hides it, and she makes her way back to the barracks unseen and gives it to her sister, who later recovered.
This was when she was in the camps?
This was in the camp. She, a huge risk, absolutely huge. Could have been shot to death at the time, and other risks that we don't. It's too graphic for young people. In fact, I've got to tell you, there's a small school district near Columbia, South Carolina, last fall, who challenged our book and said it's not appropriate for middle school. And I was appalled. And they cited an image in the book of a Nazi holding a gun to the back of a Jew's head. They said, that's just too graphic. And I'm going, are you kidding me? These kids are seeing stuff worse than that.
Much worse things in music videos, right?
In the media, absolutely. I mean, now, the social studies coordinator for that district did not know that we had already distributed books to that school district. And one of the middle school librarians wrote to me and wrote a beautiful testimonial for our book. But I got to tell you, when that district challenged my book, I again contacted our local newspaper. It was a front page story the next day. The Jerusalem Post picked up the story, and our book was number 5 on Amazon.
That's incredible. So, how did the Goldberg family feel with the finished product? Were they pleased with the graphic novel aspect of it and everything?
One of the quotes was, "Oh my God, this is my parents' story in pictures." When you read a book, you're picturing the action in your brain. You read a graphic novel, the illustrator has decided what he or she wants you to see. They were very, very pleased, and they continue to be pleased. Recently, we had the Spanish edition of our book come out, and I'll add, we have a companion teacher guide. I insisted to my publisher at the time. I know most teachers if you're a teacher and you're listening to this, you may not have ever taught with a graphic novel. So what's it like? How is it different than teaching from a regular novel? And I worked with a colleague of mine here in South Carolina who wrote the teacher guide. And I got to tell you, Jonathan, in many ways, I'm happier with the teacher guide than I am with the book itself, because it's a companion.
Well, going back now to what we just talked about a second ago. So one of the things I read, and you just talked about it too, was the disinformation from social media. And that is a tremendous danger. And we've seen it recently with kids getting, skewed facts from like places like TikTok, which has contributed to the rampant anti-Semitism in schools and around the world. So you've gone around promoting the book, talking about this book with students. So what have you found the attitude is among kids with regard to the Holocaust now? So is there denialism with the kids? Are there jokes or worse being made among students that you see?
I'll tell you what the school librarians said to me 2 years ago when the Goldberg family was sitting at a table handing out copies of their parents' story. If I heard it once, I heard it 100 times. Thank you for writing this book. And our students are really interested in the Holocaust. So I think there's renewed interest in this time in history. And as your audience probably knows, in the last 2 years, there have been several feature-length films around the Holocaust. And so it's also getting additional attention on the big screen. And so I began to think, how do we reach these young people who apparently lack this essential knowledge? Well, it dawned on me that a grandson interviewed his Holocaust surviving grandmother in the last year or so, and it got over 2 million views on TikTok. And I've said to myself, well, that's a way to reach them. And the graphic novel is another way to reach them. But I think we have to engage them. I don't want to just give a book to a school. I want to work with the teachers, which we have done. And when I'd go and speak, the students have lots of questions. They want to know more. And I'm encouraging them to think about where you go to get reliable information, which is probably the most important thing that we should be teaching today that we're not teaching. And I'm fond of saying, a lot of what we aren't teaching today is more important than what we are. And I continue to say our young people need to learn how to verify. Too many of them read something, share it without question. And that's where media literacy comes in. And I continue to be frustrated that teacher education, we teach teachers how to teach reading, which is fine, but the young people today, print is not the primary place they get their information. It's the media. So why don't we devote more time to teaching students how to read, comprehend, question the media?
I want to ask about that. Have you seen now, because you're talking about Holocaust things now, but have you seen a change in schools in regard to maybe not your book, and I'm curious about your book too, post October 7th. Has there been some sort of change in attitudes? Hey, we don't want to show this, because I've read that in certain schools too, that they don't want to show this. It shows like we're taking sides, which is mind-boggling that can even be said. But have you seen that at all, maybe in your district or in other districts that are teaching your book? I'm talking about like Jewish things though, with post October 7th. So they won't. There are schools that will say, because one of the things that bothers me always is that they go and say any Jewish thing doesn't have to do with Israel at all, and we don't want to teach this or we don't want to touch this because it could be like we're taking sides, and that's horrendous attitude. So I want to know, as far as Holocaust teaching goes, has that been an issue post October 7th that you've seen some places?
I don't have enough information to answer the question. I think educators, again, are October 7th is so new. They don't know how to touch it. They don't know how to. It's an incendiary subject for many to even to bring up.
Well, during the course of one thing, I'm also curious of your book. During the course of you going around with your book, have you heard from other people who have reached out and say, "Hey, my family has had similar experiences," or I would like to get my story out. What can you advise? Have you heard from other people like that just reached out to you because you touched them so much?
Absolutely, especially after I've spoken to large groups of people. They're anxious to tell me their story, and what I'm suggesting is write it, publish it, put it out there, because it needs to be told. Shortly after writing this book, Jonathan, I went to my public library with a question: how many Holocaust biographies were written after 1945? And they came back to me and said 70. 70. I understand. People weren't anxious to tell that story. But between 1945 and that was between 1945 and 1961, 70. What happened in 61? Eichmann was captured in Argentina and brought to Israel and put on trial. The war criminal, Adolf Eichmann. In 61, Holocaust survivors said, we want to testify. We have a story to tell. And between 1961 and 1996, 770 biographies were written. What happened in 1996? Schindler's List came out. And after the movie came into the theaters, it was then, about a year later, it was broadcast commercial free on television, I think on NBC. And so between 1996 and today, almost 8,000 biographies have been written. And so I think there are people who do want to tell their stories, and there are efforts, as you are well aware, I mean, your audience may be aware, the virtual reality opportunity for survivors to answer questions interactively from those who have the opportunity to go to a museum or a Holocaust center.
You know, that's a staggering figure that you gave me. I had no idea on that, but I could see it, that there's so few right after the war. Just people did not want to touch it. I mean, I could totally see them. It's amazing to me. That's incredible that there's so many now. I mean, that's good. So to kind of wrap this up, so what are you working on next?
Well, I have always wanted our book to be published in German. And a German publisher recently reached out. I believe, I don't know if they call it a competition, but you submit 15 or 20 pages of your book for consideration to be published in Germany. So we've just done that. I think it's important. Holocaust education, if you don't already know, is mandated in German schools. And I had a colleague from Germany speaking here last year who got a copy of our book and said, I think your book would be very appropriate to be used in German schools. So we've been pursuing that.
I wish you luck with that. That would be fantastic. Do you go around to other schools, like in other states as well, with this?
If I get an invitation, I certainly would travel or do a Zoom and answer questions. I really want teachers and students to have read the book first,
right,
so they have some context. But we welcome that opportunity. I'm looking for those opportunities to speak. In fact, later this month, down in Beaufort, South Carolina, they're honoring Anne Frank, and they've asked me to come and speak at a community event. So I'm looking forward to that. And this year, we're going to 2 education conferences, one for English teachers and one for school librarians, where we will again be distributing classroom sets of our book. So I'd like to tell your audience, anybody that purchases We Survived the Holocaust, I'm giving all of my royalties to Holocaust education.
That's fantastic. And how can people follow you or the book on social media?
We Survived the Holocaust.com is the book's website, and we are on Facebook with the same title, We Survived the Holocaust.
How about you personally? Any sites that you want to?
Yep, I'm on Facebook as frankwbaker.com. I do a lot of photography, so you might see some pictures of my grandchildren or some pictures of birds.
I'll have to look you up myself. Frank, I want to thank you for taking the time to come speak about this today. I think it's a great book, and I urge everyone to go out and get it, and also for schools to contact you and to speak to their students.
Thank you, Jonathan. A real pleasure to be with the Jewish Lens.
Thank you. Well, once again, this has been the Jewish Lens. I'm Jonathan Rosen. And again, a very special thanks to Frank Baker. And please like, comment, and subscribe.
Thanks for tuning in to the Jewish Lens, where all items used was strictly kosher.